All right, once again, welcome to this today's roundtable on global food value chain, hosted by the Baratta Center, McDonough School of Business, and Georgetown. Thanks for all of you, Georgetown alumni, friends, for being here. We thought we'll actually host an event in New York City and bring the event to New York because you couldn't make it to DC. So my name is Anil Khurana. I'm the Executive Director of the Baratta Center for Global Business, and it's my privilege to actually invite you to today's session. We have a great session for today, talking about things around the food value chain. Let me give you a little background on how this fits into the Baratta Center and the McDonough School. How many of you are not Georgetown alums, by the way? If you can just raise your hands. Okay, great to see. Welcome as well. You're a Hoya from today. So the Baratta Center was set up about a year ago, May 1st last year to be exact. And the purpose or mission of the Baratta Center is to look at the future of global business. And when I say that clearly, you can read between the lines, what's happening, what's not happening. But fundamentally, we said we'll connect business, government, and society in solving some of these questions or issues that come up today. And that's what we are about. We also said we'll connect the business world, the policy world, and society to our faculty and students as well. So we actually bring faculty and students to many of these discussions also. We started young. Last year, a startup at Georgetown University, but scaling fast. So we chose three topics to begin with. One is around global value chains. What's changing in the world of business and policy around industries around the world, and there are many of them. And food is one of them. We actually have picked a couple of others as well around transport, mobility, energy, and so on. The second theme is around cross-border investing. So we had a series of discussions around how cross-border investing by the banks, by sovereign wealth funds, private equity, venture capital, and I see some of my friends here are in the investing arena as well. And the third theme, which Gali and I and a few others are very passionate about, and we'll also host something in the near future around business for global good, which is business is not ruthless and about financial returns only. We think make a positive impact on the world as well. We have a pretty busy calendar, and hopefully after today, we'll have some of you opt into receiving the newsletter, which gives you frequent updates. And Jasper, we have an annual calendar. Jasper's going to actually share that later on of events. But fundamentally, we do an annual conference in DC. This year is going to be in October 8th in DC. And then we do a series of events around the world on topics like this. And so the next event will be in DC in July on the Ukraine reconstruction, reinvention, resilience topic, and so on and so forth. We'll have a series of things. And then in Dubai, we'll do a conference in February next year where the McDonough School of Business board will be there and do a one-day conference as well. So let me start by inviting Joyce Chang to the stage. So we'll have a keynote session and then a panel later on that Matt's going to lead. Joyce Chang, great friend of the business school and Georgetown. Not a grad from Georgetown, but a better friend than many. Joyce is also on our board. Joyce is the chair of research at JP Morgan, illustrious career in banking, undergrads from Columbia and Princeton, and for the last several years has been part of the journey at Georgetown. Joyce, can I invite you to give a few remarks, and then we jump into the rest of the session. So thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone, and to everybody who has joined virtually. It is just such a pleasure to see all of you to talk about this topic. So every year at JP Morgan, we put out an update on the state of food security, because one of the fallouts, there's a lot of discussion about the supply chain war, the tech war, the weaponization of commodities. But unfortunately, one of the biggest side effects of Russia's war on Ukraine has been the weaponization of food. So really, this combination of war, weather, and weaponization of food is what I'm going to discuss today. And I want to say just how pleased I am to be part of Georgetown's Baratta Center. As somebody who really has focused on policy and market issues, I mean, this intersection of getting experts together, people who are passionate about these issues, who are in business, but who also are very focused on the geopolitical and social risk is just so important. So let me just start with, pull up, I have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm just trying to make sure that it works. Okay, here we are. So if you take a look at the World Economic Forum top risks to monitor, food security is actually number 10. It actually ranks above looking at public sector debt distress and even energy shocks. And what I would argue is that food security is increasingly intertwined with national security issues, with the coincidence of war, weather, and stockpiling continuing and contributing to food crises, which are affecting nearly 30% of the global population. I will argue that really food insecurity is the new normal here. The combination of climate change and biodiversity loss point to recurring crises. And what we also are seeing is structurally higher food inflation and agricultural commodity prices that look like they are here to stay. So the World Economic Forum highlights a material possibility of a global food supply crisis with the continuation of the war in Ukraine, the lagged effects of the price spikes in fertilizer, and the impact of extreme weather in the top 10 risks to monitor. And if we take a look at just the framework we use to discuss this, we've really taken the United Nations SDG goals, and we've divided them into a framework, which we're calling People, Planet, and Profits, and really looking at how these three areas really intersect with each other. So just to look at some of the numbers, we estimate that nearly 282 million people in 59 countries and territories experienced high levels of acute hunger last year. That's an increase of 24 million from 2002 levels. And if you look at the severe food insecurity, it's about 11.3% of this 30% of the population. What we've seen is this is getting increasing attention, and you'll hear from other speakers that 91 countries actually signed a US-led communique condemning the use of food as a weapon of war. The UN and World Food Program estimate that you need about $25 billion to address the food insecurity problem for 100 million people, but only about 4.5 billion has actually been pledged by the various countries. We've seen new policies come about, including a food shock window from the IMF. So let's just take a look at the metrics now, and I'm going to walk through how we're looking at this related to climate change, also the stockpiling that's underway, and talk a bit about how we are looking at just the overall micro level trends as well as the macro trends. So what we see is that global progress on hunger had actually increased quite a lot before the pandemic. But what we see is that this has stalled. And a big cause of this is that climate change. Climate change has contributed to an increased number of extreme weather events, severe floods, droughts that are damaging agricultural output and pushing up food price inflation. And this combination of weather and geopolitics are compounding the supply side risk. We have seen low inventories, and therefore countries are starting to stockpile food. Our global agricultural commodities team at JP Morgan estimates that because of El Nino, that we're going to see a lot of these disruptions continue all the way through 2025 with respect to exposure to wheat, sugar, cotton, and palm oil markets. This is also further threatened by the biodiversity loss due to the reliance on a very narrow selection of crops and a handful of livestock species that provide the majority of the world's animal protein. So if you take a look at this map, you see that Africa and the emerging Middle East and Africa region are the most exposed to the wheat and the rice shortfalls. The Latin America food supply is most sensitive to the shortfalls from El Nino. But let's just take a look at the impact this has on emerging markets countries. So emerging markets countries are disproportionately impacted by food shocks. Food accounts for about 30% of the consumer basket, or double what we see in developed countries. And so we had this peak in food price inflation in April of 2022, but we're still much higher than pre-pandemic levels here in almost all countries, regardless of income levels. And so it's not just emerging markets. Like if you take a look at the United Kingdom as an example, the cost of living there has skyrocketed, and food has been a big portion of that. But when we take a look at food inflation, it's exceeded overall inflation in 80% of the 166 countries for which food CPI is tracked. And if you look at this as of as of the end of last year, almost 25% of low-income countries saw annual food inflation, domestic food inflation, that was more than 15%. So you can see a closer look at the trend. So you can see the peak, really during the pandemic and the onset of the war, how this has stabilized, but we're stabilizing at a new normal level that is significantly higher than where we had been before the crisis. If you look at this trend going back over the last decade. And you can see that even though we've seen some easing in these price pressures, this has not yet reached the low income countries. And this is where we see the real severe food distress. So taking a look at the top 10 emerging markets, countries, they're all in emerging markets for food inflation. And you can see Argentina #1, but we don't have a chart for Gaza up here, but the food inflation has been exorbitant in the Gaza region. But you can really see that this is an emerging markets crisis, and it's in particular a Middle East and Africa crisis within the emerging markets. So Africa and the Middle East are the most exposed to the wheat and the rice shortfalls. Latin America is the most sensitive to the weather shortfalls. And we've seen a number of shocks where you really cannot separate the geopolitics. There was first the Black Sea Grain Initiative that had come about with Russia's war on Ukraine, which faced breakdowns and disruptions. There were rice export restrictions that a number of countries put into place. And then there was El Nino as well. All of these risks tilted food prices to the upside. Then you have to add to that, think about some of the supply chain issues that we've seen. Remember in May of 2022, there was the baby formula crisis. You've had the rise of pork prices in China as well. So even though there is a lot of discussion on the tech and the industrial policy war, I would just say that the food security issue is one that is just also deserves equal attention here. And if we take a look at where we are today, the growing conditions across the Black Sea breadbasket remain threatening due to persistent drought. And that's driving a slower volume of production and export surplus that we think will last all the way through the 2025 season. So the wheat, if you take a look at wheat, agricultural commodity crops, the wheat stocks are at an 8-year low right now. We are seeing this in much of the breadbasket across Russia and Ukraine. That corn production also has been badly hit as well. And the and turning to El Nino, what we can see is that El Nino has been a force. You can see in these the positive areas that are shaded here in purple. That this has also been another force to contend with. But this combination we're seeing in wheat markets and in corn markets as well, 7 to 8 year lows in these markets. If you take a look at El Nino, we're also seeing that the conditions have been, very challenging also in, South Africa and in Latin America, in many of the global South countries. So what are countries doing about this? We see policy distortions that are really being institutionalized. And this really rose during the pandemic, and many of these controls have still remained in place. So if you take a look in aggregate, there are 22 countries that maintain food export policy restrictions. This means like bans on exporting foods or limitations. You saw that with fertilizer export restrictions actually impacted more than 40% of the global trade that we saw in nitrogenous and phosphate exports. So 40% of the trade. So if we think about this from a broader trade perspective, 1 out of every 5 calories is actually cross-border. And very much dependent on trade activity. And so 1 in 5 calories consumed is cross-border, depends on trade. And if you look at it, 5 countries only are responsible for 75% of agri-food exports. China is actually the largest exporter of food, but even for China, they produce only about 66% of the food that they need. So food stockpiling, we see, has become more of an issue, which I'm going to talk about. So these fertilizer restrictions, remain in place. So these were put in as emergency measures, but increasingly, as we've seen with many of the measures that were put into place during the crisis, they have become the new normal and what is now in place as policy. So if we take a look, I want to talk about just the stockpiling of food right now, because we hear about things like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve Fund. We hear about in Washington, D.C., the desire to start a resilience trust fund as well. But I wanted to just take a look at the stockpiling of commodities and who owns the agricultural commodities. And so food stockpiling continues. If you actually take a look at visible inventories in China right now. So the right-hand chart here is visible inventories in China, but copper, which is at an all-time high, China has 95% of the visible inventory. Aluminum, 77%. But taking a look at at wheat and corn, you're looking at 50 to 60% of the inventory, of visible inventory that is held in China right now. And one trend that we have been seeing in China is an increase in commodity imports, a desire not to hold as much in US dollars, but to actually hold more in commodity inventories. So you can see that this is really an issue that does feed very much into the geopolitics and the national security issues. And one trend that we have seen is if you look at the overall commodity markets right now, for emerging markets, the oil price cap in Russia was a way in which it was sort of a windfall for many emerging markets. They could go to Russia, buy oil below the market price and settle in non-dollars. So when we look at commodity trade that is occurring globally right now, we estimate that just in the last 2 years, probably about 15 to 20% of trade is being settled in non-dollars for what used to be a market that was in dollars. So you can just see how these interlinkages, it's not just the technology manufacturing trade we're talking about, even the movements that we're seeing between commodity markets are starting to transform. Now, where does the US fit in here? So the US agricultural exports are only 8% of US exports. The US is more efficient in many ways in some of its production, but you can see that this is a very small share actually relative to other parts of the world. And then we have this trend of stockpiling, by China. So let me just stop there. Those are just some opening remarks to really set the stage for the discussion that you're going to hear about. So the questions we've been asked to ask, are we generating enough food to feed the world's population? Well, we're not generating enough to get it to the areas that need it most efficiently. And even the official creditor programs that we have seen put into place right now are doing only a small fraction of that. How is climate change affecting the availability of food here? We're seeing the institutionalization of price distortions through the bans and the limitations that we're seeing on fertilizer and also the stockpiling which has occurred. And the geopolitics has contributed to these issues related to food security and contributing really to a cost of living crisis and a migration crisis, which is occurring occurring in different parts of the world right now, just given the state of world hunger right now. So I think, we are asked, what new technologies might ensure a more resilient and sustainable, agricultural supply chain. There definitely is more that can be done on this front with respect to first addressing the biodiversity issues, but also looking at fertilizer and more efficient ways to use less water, less land, and less fertilizer. So let me stop there and just see if there are any questions. Yes.
Oh, thank you. One of the things in this whole array of very concerning issues, which are interactive and cumulative that I didn't hear mentioned, has to do with commodities markets themselves. I remember in 2010, there was a New England Research Institute complex systems analysis of the drivers of, for example, the Arab Spring and those analyses. And the number 2 driver was climate change itself.
Yes.
The number 1 driver was speculation in the commodities markets. And I wonder if you could help me understand the degree to which that is an issue here as well, and what dominantly explains the persistent inflation.
Yeah, so no, I think it's a great question. I think the commodity market is undergoing a structural shift right now. And even when we are asked about asset allocation and looking at financial markets, that is the one market where we think there's another 10% upside on commodity prices really across the complex. And and so I think, what are those structural shifts that are underway with the commodities market to talk to? Well, they start from everything from AI and energy demand. They start from just the reducing the dependency due to geopolitics. I was recently, in Germany, and they were 55% dependent on Russia for liquid natural gas, and that has now 85% dependent on the U.S. now, where that's actually moved very quickly. That's actually causing some concern. There's a lot of concerns after their European Parliament elections, but part of it is just like where they're sourcing the energy from and the energy security issues. There's the demand for energy because of AI. And I think there were some surprises. I think very few people would have thought when gas at the pump was $5 in 2022 that the US would emerge as the #1 producer of global crude oil, and be able to do it more efficiently with respect to the costs. And that seems to me like it has spurred a whole debate that we had a strategic petroleum reserve fund that we used at moments. Should we have this for other commodities, particularly looking at critical minerals? So you could also see the tariffs are another issue. So the quadrupling of the tariffs on critical minerals that was announced on May 14th, there's a whole question, because China has a monopoly on critical minerals, on rare earth, whether that will be the way they retaliate, that they are so dependent on technology that they won't use that as the vehicle, but it could be more retaliation through the commodity markets. And then on top of that, you still have the increased demand. And so this has sort of repriced the whole discussion. Increasingly, we don't see ESG being used. It's being called sustainability or renewable energy rather than sort of ESG as we talked about it a number of years ago. But I think the shifts are structural in nature. They are because of the geopolitics, even though many countries, 40 countries went in on the sanctions, 2/3 of the countries didn't, and emerging markets didn't. And emerging markets is also where you have the food crises. So this is where you see the trade really transforming with respect to the way in which trade is being settled in these markets. So I think it's a great question. So the first question is there speculation? Well, the stockpiling sort of leads to some of the speculation. The tariffs lead to, is there going to be retaliation through critical minerals? But these are all distortions that we didn't talk about. Like, who talked about stockpiling food? really before this crisis, broke out a few years ago. But I think that you are in store for structurally higher commodity prices here. And that also relates to, the demand in AI as well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. That was an excellent overview of what's happening with respect to food and fuel and fiber and feed. This may not be within your wheelhouse per se, but and I understand the focus on production because obviously that's something you can attach numbers to. What do you see as changes imposed by climate relative to other aspects of food security, such as food safety, such as food nutrition? Are those things that are within your overview of what's happening relative to food systems per se?
Well, one thing that I have actually found very interesting is that, all of this talk about, Ozempic and, these, weight, or the, appetite suppressants has actually taken a lot of the investment away from what had been discussed even in 2022, more on the food security issues, where you actually see that corporations are spending more time looking at this whole issue on how the whole market is changing in advanced countries. So, what I really worry about is that, where you need the innovation, maybe you're going to have sort of the investment actually shift to areas that sort of are in the most popular focus rather than in food security, which I think had actually a bit more focus 2 years ago than it does right now. And that is why for the emerging markets countries, it's become even more important that the official creditor resources are put into place. So, as an example, like the IMF created this like food shock window that countries experiencing a food shock could go and, get the resources more quickly. But I feel like that in corporations, there was a period where when ESG was sort of more in focus, that there was more sort of discussion on what to do about food security. And some of that has now moved to a different discussion in advanced economies on sort of, biotech and what is driving sort of, the stock market right now, which is looking at just, how these companies that have focused on, the appetite suppressant drugs have actually moved ahead. So I think it's a pretty complicated issue here. It's still one that even just like when we think about industrial policy, like the IRA that has been put into place, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and sciences, I mean, really one needs to ask, do you also possibly need to, create something that incentivizes and provides like sort of the credits to incentivize the investment in this area? I mean, that's one question I would raise.
Curious because like a lot of hi. A thing that is almost an inevitable byproduct of global warming is mass migration. If you look at a lot of the countries on these charts, they have neighbors that are, going to inevitably the climates are going to warm up. People are going to be moving. Conflict obviously naturally arises from that. How do we create an environment, whether it be through incentives or policies or otherwise, that would encourage countries to invite that, and not necessarily that, but just to stabilize when that inevitably happens, because it's going to happen, right? And then the byproduct is what, civil war or otherwise. So how do we? And I don't know if there are any examples of countries that are already doing that well, but I'm just curious what are some potential scenarios?
I think it's a great question, and it's really kind of a political question. I mean, if you take a look at the European parliamentary elections or the US elections, like immigration comes out as, in the top 2 issues right after the economy. And what you do with the migrant crisis. And when we think about just sort of, some of the areas that are most vulnerable, and, I call it sort of where the mini fires are at, but it's really the Horn of Africa. And you can also see just on this map that just a lot of the big the countries that have food inflation, like look at Haiti. Haiti is 90% controlled by gangs now. Could you have a migrant problem if that regime really does fall? You've had sort of the chronic issues on Venezuela on how they do a political, transition. You look at, Egypt right now, sort of in an area that has a lot of vulnerability. So I really feel like it's hard to separate that from the overall geopolitical issues. I mean, there's food security causing part of this, but then there's just the displacement because of conflict itself and governability itself, in the country. And so that's why I think that it has really fallen on official creditors to try to provide that type of humanitarian relief, and to create different facilities and windows to provide that type of relief as well. But I don't think there's a very easy answer to that when you actually look at the countries that really are the most vulnerable here, and they also have the climate issues. I mean, take a look at really how much of that is, concentrated in the global south.
Hi. Stepping away from areas where there's tremendous conflict, because clearly it's difficult to understand exactly what's happening there. My concern is with respect to the control of the food chain that we have with big governments and big corporations. There's a lot of greenwashing, and given the fact that we live in Latin America, we see firsthand the fact that a lot of farmers are just not getting paid what they need to get paid. They don't get the financing they need. They don't get access to the materials they need. So basically, these big companies are driving them to bankruptcy. And that obviously affects how much, the food supply, and drives and sort of it perpetuates this cycle. So what are your comments with respect to big governments and big companies, and how do we break that that part of the food chain?
See, I don't think you're going to be able to break that part of the food chain. And one report that's really worth taking a look at is the IMF came out with a report looking at industrial policy. So in 2023, you had globally 2,500 industrial policies implemented around the world. About 2/3 of those which were considered trade distorting. So very hard to even talk about free trade policy when you have this rise of industrial policy. But I think this is just it, is that each country has kind of looked at how do we become more self-sufficient. And I think you're right. There's this crowding out that's occurring as well. And, even when I have been in Europe or in Latin America, we have heard from many of them, well, look, even this big push to get infrastructure in Latin America, some of this is getting crowded out to the US right now because you've put into place, these other measures where they're incentivized, actually to go more to the US. And that's one thing that we actually kind of looked at quite ironically, is that if you actually look at the areas that are getting the most renewable energy, so even though the ESG isn't, even though the US isn't as far ahead on ESG as Europe, it's actually almost de facto doing more on renewable energy because of the tax credits. And ironically, it's going into the red states. So I guess the way I would answer this is that there's policy, and then there's just the way that policy has changed to greater use of industrial policy. And that's what has been incentivizing a lot of the foreign direct investment flows. So what we're seeing to emerging markets overall, China being the most striking, those there's been a real decline in investment in emerging markets. Even for Mexico, which is sort of one of the darlings of the moment, it's remained stable, but it hasn't actually gone up because there really is reshoring back to the United States because of the incentives that have been put into place with industrial policy. So I don't think there's a really easy answer to that, but I think you're right. The smaller farmers then get affected by that. So you have sort of at the macro level, there's more reshoring and self-sufficiency and stockpiling that is occurring. But you also have that, the incentives, are meaning that just where investment flows are going are not necessarily where they are most needed.
Thanks for very insightful comments. Just one, I just want to bring it a little bit closer to home for you. As one of the largest financial institutions in the world, JP Morgan, I think that the business model is you take deposits from individual investors and then you make that capital available to businesses. One of the things I'd like to understand is in the last few years, as some of these issues have become more prominent, and as the image of the banking industry and the pressures, on how you operate become more critical. Do you see any changes in terms of the way capital allocation happens within a large institution like JP Morgan? For example, I mean, one of the things I'm always puzzled about is there's a lot of announcements and PR around banks' activities on renewable energy and energy, but people in general don't see, feel, eat electrons. People see, feel, eat food, and they can react much more to initiatives that large institutions, aggregators of capital can take in that sphere. But I haven't seen any real change. Maybe you know more about it, so I'd love to hear.
No, well, so what we did at JP Morgan is that we actually created a whole development finance group about 6 years ago. And even just sort of institutionalizing that once a year, there's a food security report that we put out with that tries to look across the macro issues, but we also try to get our equity analysts to take a look at this. And what you do find is that some of the larger corporations are redirecting their investment to the areas they find the most profitable, which is not always food security. But the goals of the development finance institution and have really been, how can we partner with the official creditor organizations to make better use to getting capital to areas that wouldn't receive it otherwise. And so, I was recently in DC around the spring meetings. We had about 70 of the development finance institutions in to sort of just brainstorm on these issues. But a lot of the things that we have done have been like, how do we work with them on how they're using guarantees to actually make more capital available for development finance? More of this has been on renewable energy than food security per se for what JP Morgan has worked on. But we felt that what we needed to do was actually create a special dedicated unit. A lot of the staff have come from the IFC for that. And we've basically partnered with them to see how we can get financing, not just to the largest middle income emerging markets countries, because they have access to capital, but how do you actually get them to, like a lot of the stans, as an example, or some more of the municipal and local governments, and how can you also partner so that you can actually work with the IFC and the World Bank, and a lot of these initiatives that Ajay Banga has been putting out on how you sort of make this simpler and something that's more investable so that it can go into an index and that you can create like a prototype for this. And I do think that, a lot of the, ESG is kind of being renamed sustainability, but a lot of the efforts on it had focused so much on disclosure instead of on how you could actually get the capital mobilized. That you're seeing backlash, like you're seeing in Europe, that there were these proposals from investment managers where they're basically saying, look, reduce the amount of bureaucracy by at least, and reporting requirements by 25%. So I think you have to look at more, what are the policies they're going to in place that are actually going to mobilize capital. So at JP Morgan was the development finance institution creating a special group that's dedicated to working with the development banks on this issue and coming up with more creative solutions. And that's looking at, how do you collateralize certain things? How do you use guarantees? But you're seeing this becoming, sort of front and center part of the whole discussion on, well, it's not being called industrial policy now. I think the new word has been American economic statescraft. That's what it's being called. But it is like, how do you use incentives also to get the emerging markets countries to work with you, including guarantees, and including that, not just rolling over the debt. I mean, and extending the maturity, but do you need to do something more concessional in nature? So I think it's important to form the partnerships, because I think the private sector, if you work with the official creditors, and that is sort of the Ajay Banga model going forward, is trying to say, how can we just leverage and mobilize more capital to get out and not have so much of the focus on the reporting requirements?
Thank you, Joyce. So interesting to look at all that, because I look at it from a farming point of view. I look at it as a little farmer, 90% of world farming is done by smallholder farms. You're talking about 1 acre to 10 max. And all the policies and all the discussions are really for big industrial agriculture. And as Linda well pointed out, and I was sure you're going to talk about health, actually, 70% of and I'll concentrate on the US because otherwise I'll go on for hours, but 70% of food in the US is processed and ultra processed food. 98% of the agriculture in the US is actually filled with agrochemicals. You talked about nitrogen and the shortage of nitrogen. But as Louis Siska can tell you, we have more nitrogen than we know what to do with, but we packaged and marketed it to the farmers as if they need it. Meantime, to create agrochemicals, you're using a lot of fossil fuels. You're completely dependent on fossil fuels. And at the end of the day, agrochemicals are a drug. So you are basically creating an addiction of the farming industry and consumers to agrochemicals, which are essentially drugs. So what ends up happening is we're creating an incredible economic cycle where we're dependent on agrochemicals to grow our food. Our food makes us sick. We are then depend completely on the healthcare system, which is broken beyond the food system. You're talking about obesity, diabetes, and all the issues we have in the US directly correlates to all that. So we create the problem and then try and treat it with a little bit of policy, a little bit of nice talk, ESG and alternative energies. More than 60% of the population worldwide will never have access to any of that. And food security can be cured if we really want to, because there is no food shortage, in the sense that there is a lot of food waste, there is a lot of processed food, but there is no shortage. Africa used to be the top agricultural continent in the world. They produced healthy, incredible food until colonialism happened. So how do we go back to teach them how to fish and not give them the fish? And instead of fish, we're giving them processed food that makes them sick. The majority of food that we're giving around the world to cure hunger is cornmeal. Cornmeal, that's what they get. They don't get fruits and vegetables. They don't get proteins. They get cornmeal. And the corn is, processed. It's genetically modified. It's shown to cause cancer. I mean, Monsanto trials right now with glyphosates are, in the hundreds of millions of dollars because it's already proven, it's in the science, but there's no awareness and people don't talk about it. So my long-winded speech is, how to create more awareness, because COP28 does not address any of the climate change issues at the end of the day. It's a political nightmare. USAID has more money than they know what to do with. And no, it's not immigration, it's refugees, and it's due to climate change, food, and health. So we're creating the problem, and then we try to put a little Band-Aid on it to keep creating the problems, because war makes money. Soil doesn't, agriculture doesn't, right? So
no, I mean, you bring up some really good points, and I feel like, a lot of this is even more exaggerated because now you're getting a world that's dividing into trading blocks, and it's looking at scalability and more policy distortions, not less. So that's why I do think that, so much of this has to be kickstarted from the official creditor community, though. Then you need to find ways, just as they have even with renewable energy, where we are more finding ways to partner together, to work on this as well, so that we, create vehicles that can be, accomplish two things, because you need to have something that's scalable, oftentimes, for it to be marketable in an investment community, but also to address the core of the problem. But I think it probably does start with the official creditors really saying that, look, the post-Bretton Woods mandate is changing right now too, because the way the world is, we're in this sort of pendulum now where we're swinging back into trading blocks and have to, sort of deal with the reality of that. So, but I think they are, just excellent points that just some of these micro level issues have been really more challenging to address given the geopolitics that have occurred. Thank you. Thank you.
Joyce, thank you so much for setting the stage for a great discussion, and thanks for the great questions as well. I think, as we said earlier, the Baratta Center hopefully convenes discussion like this to begin to solve, not begin to, but continue solving issues. So with that, let me invite Matt McDonough, who is a professor at Georgetown University, is also a grad from the law school many, many years ago, a career in finance, policy, food, and a few others. Till recently, couple of years ago, he was actually advising Secretary Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, ex-Pepsi executive, ex-lawyer as well. So Matt's got a full spectrum of capabilities and skills and experience to bring our panel together. So Gali, Sean, Baron, and Rajiv, I think, Matt, I invite you to bring your panelists on as well, and look forward to great discussion. And we won't solve it today. We'll set the stage to begin to have conversation like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Anil. And against that wonderful backdrop, thank you very much, Joyce. Against that wonderful backdrop, we have a very deep panel with us. We have the two leading nonprofit voices in this issue, and as we look across the globe to try to solve these problems, and two of the most innovative voices from the private sector. And let me quickly introduce them individually, then turn the podium over to them, and we have plenty of time for questions and answers as well. Sean Callahan is the president and CEO of Catholic Relief Services, obviously a group that we all are very familiar with. They put the gospel into action by supporting humanitarian and developmental initiatives and throughout partnerships with local-based, faith-based, and secular institutions. Catholic Relief Services is responsible for over $1 billion every year of food and aid being distributed around the world to over 110 countries. World Food Program, the equal of Catholic Relief Services. Baron Seeger is the president and chief executive officer. The numbers there are amazing. 150 million people, over 120 countries, and over 15 billion meals. Baron and Sean, we're very happy to have you here. From the private sector, two great voices as well. You've already heard some of the questions that Gali has already asked, which are terrific. And I'm looking forward to her more formal comments as well. Gali, again, Georgetown class of 1993, is the co-founder of Buena Vida Specialty Coffee in Costa Rica. She actively promotes farmer prosperity through true direct farm direct trade, and is a wonderful voice, not just for small business, but also for agricultural practices. And then finally, Rajiv Singh, my friend from the private sector. Rajiv and I are participating in a number of activities together. Rajiv, the formerly in charge of Rabobank here in the United States, has turned to the venture capital. And between venture capital and between private sector investment, we have two great voices as well. So let me stop there, turn the podium over to each of our panelists. We have plenty of time afterwards for questions, so save those questions, but we'll do the questions after each panelist has a chance to speak. And let's, I think we're going to sequence, we're going to start with Baron, Gali, and then Sean, and end up with Rajiv. So Baron, can you join us here?
Here?
Wherever you feel comfortable.
Can everybody hear me okay? All right, good. So listen, first of all, thank you for having me as a panelist today. I actually live in Washington, so nice trip to New York, I think, as we talk about climate. A lot of things happening even in the US this week. The world is clearly warming. We're going to see that this week on the West Coast. And then if you think about just Miami 3 days ago. So the good news is that there is enough food in the world to feed everybody. Right, you know there's bad news coming. The bad news is that, because of access, availability, and disruptions, we're having a really hard time making sure that food gets to those who really need it. And I know we're talking about climate and conflict. I won't repeat a lot of what's been said, but I will say that the most vulnerable in the world are suffering the most because of climate. And an interesting thing I always like to say is that those countries that emit the least amount in greenhouse emissions suffer the most. And maybe I use Pakistan had incredible floods over the last year, because of climate. They're suffering because of the greenhouse emissions coming from many countries. We're seeing droughts that are lasting much longer, and we're seeing rains that are much harder. If you think about the hurricane season coming up, if you live in the Caribbean somewhere, it is the worst thing that anybody can think about, because you know that you're probably going to get hit this year. I would say, for the World Food Program, there are two centers of things that we focus on. One is that emergency assistance. Today, we know that 309 million people around the world are suffering from acute hunger. More troubling than that is that we have 42 million people around the world that are marching towards starvation. And we hear a lot about Gaza today, but unfortunately, we have a lot of forgotten emergencies. Somebody mentioned Haiti earlier today. It's clearly is top of mind for us. We're probably going to see, pockets of famine in Haiti. A lot of the world is focused on Sudan. So I'm going to talk about climate, but then I'm going to insert just a few things on conflict, because we have to have a conversation about conflict in this conversation. So what I would say is three or four pillars for what we do. Number one, because the world is heating up, we have to anticipate. So anticipation means that we have to think about the products that are grown, more drought resistant products. Think about the use of solar energy for irrigation. We have to think about how we're going to restore the land, because when floods and natural disasters come, if you think about flying from Haiti to the DR, it's like flying over a desert versus getting into lots of trees. So we have to make sure that we are replanting the earth as we're taking parts of the earth to feed ourselves, and a lot of trees and crops are growing because of climate. We have to make sure that we are preparing through innovation. Innovation is one of the major investments that the World Food Program is focused on today. And innovation could be how we're using hydroponics to help feed communities, but also take to local markets. We just did an event with Google last week. Chase, my colleague from the World Food Program's here. Google is really helping the World Food Program around AI. Google is doing a lot of the weather forecasting, because what you may not know is probably half us got up this morning and we said, how hot is it going to be in New York today? But if you're in, whether it's El Salvador or you're in parts of Africa, there is no weather forecasting system. I would just say that we have to think of innovations around insurance. The World Food Program does insurance for crops and for livestock, because you have to really make sure that farmers are going to invest, but they're also going to be they're taking little risk, I would say.
They need to be protected, yeah.
And then the last thing I'll say is preparedness for the World Food Program. We're the biggest provider of cash-based transfers. So I met when I was in Honduras a couple of years ago. Honduras hit back-to-back 2 hurricanes, within, I think, 10 days. And so sometimes communities need a hand up for a short amount of time. And so, $100 for a family of 4 over a 4-month period. But as we talk about cash-based transfers, part of that is also training, because while a lot of countries are poor and malnourished, we also are suffering from communities that have obesity issues. And so it's also training to buy the right food, and making sure that we're focused on local homegrown foods. We're not going to solve hunger through putting product on trains and boats. We're going to do it by locally farming. And so, again, proud to be here, proud to have part of this discussion. I'll end on conflict. The number one driver of hunger in the world today is conflict, whether it is a war in Gaza or whether it is gangs in Haiti. And until we address conflict, hunger is going to continue to increase.
Thank you, Baron. Thank you.
Thank you, Baron.
Let's turn from the national to perhaps a more local approach. The McDonough School of Business is very proud of its graduates and very proud of you, Gali.
Thank you.
And ask you for some comments, please, Gali.
So I think this is the right approach because hearing Joyce and, talking on the panel here among us, everybody's addressing a lot of the issues on a 30,000 foot level, but they're not really bringing it down to the practicality of solving it. And I'm going to quote Dr. Lewis, don't treat soil like dirt and amazing things will happen. Growing food locally is already proven to be a solution, like Baron said. Immigration seems to be a problem for frontiers. It's a problem for countries. The US has a huge immigration issue right now that is not being addressed properly. And I turn to USDA, I turn to the US government, I turn to a big institution and say, really, the immigration problem would not be hard to solve if you paid the workers in their countries, if you provide proper channels for that money to really flow where it has to flow. So when the US opens immigration to refugees from Nicaragua for political asylum, or then Guatemala goes along, Honduras, El Salvador, what happens? There's no local workers, and there's no local workers for farmers, and therefore the food gets affected. And it's a whole chain reaction effect. I think we need to address problems on a more micro level than macro level, because policymakers have sometimes not the best intentions, and they're into politics and money and where the money flows. But for example, like you said, there is no food shortage, and conflict is driven by, at the end of the day, our politics. Farmers is beyond just the food supply and hunger. It's really solves immigration, it solves conflict, and it definitely solves climate change. So the reason I became an advocate for Kiss the Ground and Common Ground documentaries is because they put together in a very elementary way how soil will save us. How will soil really be a lot of the answers? Like a lot of you said, the technologies, most people don't have access to those technologies, and they really make a dent at the end of the day in the problem. Food makes a huge dent. Why? Because it's food and healthcare. Like you said, it's hunger and obesity. It's both sides of the equation. So through the coffee industry, what we're trying to do is re-engineer the entire industry, because we'll start with the fact that coffee is not a commodity and should not be a commodity. It's one of the hardest crops to grow. It is growing, Brazil is the #1 producer, and then you have Vietnam, you have Ethiopia and Colombia. There's so many problems that are emerging because of coffee growth. Why? Because the coffee growers do not get enough compensation. A cup of coffee in New York costs $7. The farmer might get 5-6 cents of it. They can't pay the workers. It creates climate change, literally creates it. So if we want to avoid it, why not stop creating it to begin with? We've proven, when you look at Africa, as I mentioned, was the most rich agricultural continent. You have countries like, Mexico, talking about Mexico, the Chihuahua Desert, and you see it clearly in Common Ground. You can regrow and create weather patterns all over again. Guanacaste, Costa Rica, today is like a desert. It's all cattle. It used to be green. It used to be forest. It used to be primary forests. And it's not the cow, it's the how. Everybody's talking about not eating beef. That's not the issue. And you saw what happened with Beyond Beef. I mean, it's filled with glyphosate. The stock, blew off the charts. We're looking at now beanless coffee. How is that going to solve our problem? And nobody's talking about nutrients. Our food is 50% less nutrient dense than it used to be. And a lot of the food, like I said, the US is 70% or more processed foods. We need to go back to basics. We got to stop making the problems more complicated than they are to try and solve them all for money. So I think, I can go on and on, but I think the European Union is trying to solve it. They created Pacto Verde and EUDR. I think the biggest problem right now is that nobody understands what they wrote or what they want or who's paying for it, how you measure it, and what does it really mean. So guess what? The small farmers are the one that are going to pay for it, because you know, when, I'm not going to mention name, I'm going to be good, but when the big coffee companies come to farmers and say, you have to be fair trade, you have to be Rainforest Alliance, you have to be bird friendly certificate, guess what? We'll pay for it. Oh, of course they'll pay for it. The farmer just has to follow the rules. They don't even believe it. They don't benefit from it. Most farmers don't even see that money. It's all about marketing, greenwashing, pinkwashing, etc. We gotta teach consumers, and I think that's where tech has to come in. How do we the consumers, make a difference? Because we vote with our purchasing power. So how do we get educated about what really is going on and demask what we're being told? Even USDA organic, I'm shocked how much organic coffee is out there, but I'm out there in the farms, traveling Latin America. It doesn't exist in most countries. So where is it coming from? Where's all this organic coffee? And Luis, correct me if I'm wrong, but organic doesn't mean regenerative. And organic does not solve, not for farmer prosperity, not for soil health, not for our health. It doesn't. So why are we sold on all these concepts that at the end of the day actually make us sicker and hungrier?
So does that mean we're going to go to Starbucks after this?
The coffee here is amazing. And no, that's the other thing. I mean, a lot of the coffee out there is burnt, and 90% of the population have never even tasted coffee because it's burnt beans and it's low quality coffee masked by highly roasted means.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to have Catholic Relief Services with Georgetown in the same room. Next, Sean Callahan. Sean?
Thank you, Matt. And thank you all for being here today. Not only is this a business issue, and I appreciate the focus on it by the Baratta Center and the McDonough School of Business, but it's also a moral imperative that we all have to focus on right now. And Gali just talked about bringing it to the local level. So I'd like to take 2 minutes of my speaking and have them just show you a quick video on how we can get it down to the local level.
Imagine you are holding a solution right in your hands that could reverse the plight of small farmers across Central America and beyond, whose lives depend on rainfall. A solution that could save water and restore soil, increase yields, revive communities, reduce migration, build prosperity from the ground up. This is water smart agriculture, Agua y Suelo para la Agricultura, or ASA, the practice of managing soil to manage water to improve yields, sometimes in just one harvest, with methods that are practical, inexpensive, and long-lasting. ASA is cultivating the future for small-scale farmers and those who depend on them for food. By sharing this proven approach to maximize water, our mission is to collaborate together with governments, scientists, and local leaders and organizations to build a network of knowledge and resources that serve a critical mass of farmers and their families. We want to build momentum and inspire a movement to adopt water-smart agricultural practices around the world, working with communities to develop customized solutions for them, by them, and with them, by increasing water absorption and retention in the soil, stopping erosion, using cover crops to protect soil, and fertilizing with the right dose at the right time, all to get more corn, beans, and coffee for every drop of water.
La comunidad es una de las comunidades más secas. Siempre tenemos problemas, a veces de sequía, a veces de mucha lluvia, aparecen ataques de plagas y enfermedades. Con este proceso de aprendizaje podemos amortiguar o estar un poco preparados para ciertos cambios que pueden ver dentro del clima.
Central America and Mexico are already seeing the promise of water-smart agriculture come alive, putting food on tables and returning stability to farmers and their futures.
Estamos aprendiendo mucho para poder hacerle frente a lo que es el cambio climático.
The solution is right under our feet, and the way to spread the word, harness the power of nature, and reduce poverty is right at your fingertips. Find out more about how water-smart agriculture brings prosperity from the ground up.
So one of the reasons why I just wanted to show that was, often we hear about the crises that are going on in the world right now and that there's no solution and we might as well just throw up our hands. If you look at these pictures that are currently up there, this is over 3 years how this watershed changed and what that can mean. And so we can do things with investment that can change things. What do you have to do? Address it at a local level. Talk to the local people. Gali was mentioning that before. When we get people out there who understand how to conserve the soil, then we can move forward much more into the future. The second thing is political. We see a lot of political divisions that are out there. We can't solve the political issue at the macro level, but going out there and local politicians, the alcaldes, the mayors in many places, are the ways that we can get this accomplished. Climate and conflict, as we hear before, are crucial to the whole situation. The climate change in many areas, we can see crops moving up the hillside because it's getting so hot. We need to make sure that we get more agroforestry that gets out there so that people not only have trees, but that they can make some income from them. The other thing is, we talked about, and you heard about migration as being a factor, which is really crucial. Well, one of the things with migration is we keep hearing about the push factors, but what are the stay factors? What cause people to stay on their land? And the stay factors are a couple. One of them is that their voice is heard in the village and the community. And who are we talking about? Women and youth. If we promote more and more women's participation and youth participation, in many of the countries in which we work, the population under age 25 is now about 65%, 65%. That population has to have an opportunity to move forward, or they're going to move and walk to other places. I was in El Salvador and we were at Maria Jose's farm and we went out there and we were looking at it. She was diversifying her crops. She was doing water smart agriculture so that she could make it happen. And there was another gentleman who was kind of walking around the perimeter, and I went up to him and Jose, as I was speaking to him, said, I was one step away from going north. And I said, what caused you to change? And he said, this program. New seeds, drought resilient opportunities that we can have. How do I save water in different areas? And participation in the local community. And then fourthly was making sure our local government did not inhibit us from being able to move forward. And through that, they got the local mayors together, and all of the mayors started putting pressure on the central government to move that forward. The other thing is we have to look at our time horizons. We as Americans, we like things to happen overnight. This picture here took 3 years, but when we do development initiatives, we really need to look at the 5 and 10-year time frame. We need to make sure we invest. Our strategy as an agency, while others were moving from a 5-year to a 3-year strategy, we moved from a 5-year to a 12-year strategy. What did that tell the local people on the ground? That we were going to invest in them for the long term. You all know as business people, if you're going to invest in something overnight and then it doesn't work, everything's down. But if you invest over a time period and make sure that it's productive, you can have substantial change as we move forward. So I would just say, think about the different responses. We have to think newly and creatively about how we address these needs. And it isn't just that we do something and we walk away from it, that we deliver food or not, but that we actually integrate the local communities into that. Baron and I both have been in the business of delivering food, but much more effective is providing resources so local communities can supplement that food or produce it themselves. Years ago in Ghana, we used to have a food aid program with the schools like a McGovern Dole that we currently have in the United States. Now the Ghana government is paying all the resources to local farmers to provide food for those schools. Those are the directions we need to head.
Thank you, Sean. And both Baron and Sean are being very modest in terms of the impact their organizations have, billions of dollars and hundreds of millions of people. But this is a role not just for the public sector, not just for the nonprofit sector, but also for the private sector. And I thought, Rajiv, could you talk a little bit about how you might see the role of the private sector expanding its impact here?
Thanks. And then it was very heartening to hear about solutions, but also I think you mentioned longer term orientation going from 5 years to 12 years. So I think ironically, as our problems become more urgent and the time frame for acting on them and creating, the change that is required becomes more compressed, we need more longer term orientation from a capital perspective as well. But so I'll talk a little bit about sort of where I'm coming from. We need enormous amounts of capital to go into these solutions to create more resilient food systems, food security. And Joyce, I apologize for the question that I had for you, because I have been in the financial services sector for my career. For 25 years, I've been a private equity investor. And earlier on in my career, I made a lot of money for the shareholders of the institutions I worked for. But then I realized it was I joined Rabobank, which Matt mentioned, where I became the CEO for North America for them. That was the place where I kind of found my calling. I realized that because they focus on the food system, the largest financial institution focused on food and agriculture, and I got to understand the system as a system and the players. And the one thing that I realized, first on the bad side, was that in this system, the way it has operated since World War II primarily, it has been very successful in doing a lot of good things in terms of producing food and making these global supply chains work. But on the other hand, it has screwed up three big things. One, it has screwed up our planetary health, soil. And I think that was the first to be understood, the impact that our agriculture and food systems have on sustainability, carbon, methane, on all the measures that I think started to get attention 10, 15 years ago. The second thing it has screwed up is human health. And that was a bit late. I think it's only even now not being fully discussed and understood as to how much damage our food system, just by the way it's being operated, has done to human health and public health. And then the third thing it has screwed up is our social structures and social equity. As I think you heard, if you look at food systems, depending on the country you're looking at, it's 10 to 20% of GDP. It's often the largest employer. It's often the sector where women are the most important players. And it's exactly those people at the beginning of these value chains that bear the brunt of the risk. They capture the least amount of value. There are not enough tools like insurance, and there's not enough tools to manage the risk across the supply chain so that you could have more equitable distribution of that risk. So that kind of, that realization in my career kind of became my calling, and I then left running a financial institution to start to do something about it. First, started an organization called Food Shot Global, which was a challenge program which kind of highlighted big problems like the ones I'm talking about, but then aggregated capital from a number of people and provided a collaborative capital platform to act on it. And then we did it in two ways. One was to provide help in terms of grants and prizes for people who are doing great work in terms of policy or research, but also made equity investments in terms of solutions that were going to make a dent and hopefully going to be scalable solutions for these areas. And that, as Matt mentioned, I think, so I went from being more sort of traditional private equity investor to a venture investor. And that was all good for quite some time, except for the last 2 years. Last 2 years have been, in my opinion, the toughest and the most horrible period as far as venture investing, especially if you're investing for innovation in the food systems. I've had a number of bankruptcies. It's been really bad. And the one thing that I'd note is that a number of companies that I have seen fail and have been kind of really sad about the fate of some of those teams and companies is there was nothing wrong with what they were pursuing, with the technology or the idea. It was just that they ran out of time and they ran out of capital. And there was not enough available at the right time to replace that. So that's one big problem that I see going forward, in terms of the kinds of changes we are all, both motivated and determined to make. So how do we get that kind of capital and understanding to these, to people who are doing something about it, but make it available to them not on an episodic basis or based on models that have worked in perhaps other sectors that have different, risk profiles and timelines. So that's one. The other thing that and I realized in my banking career was, and I started to see that around 2013 or so. After that, the first big commodity jump that we saw that caused the Arab Spring and so on, was that for the first time, my clients and counterparts who, you would call big food and big ag these days, the likes of Pepsi, where Matt spent a number of years, General Mills, Kellogg, big food, but also Monsanto, Syngenta, big ag, they were all facing a crisis they had not encountered before. And this wasn't just these companies, maybe in the CPG sides, losing market share to emerging brands. That was happening. That was kind of the headline. Or for these inputs companies that they were finding that R&D effectiveness was suddenly going way down. It was something deeper than that. And at boardrooms in these companies, when I was with their management, the discussion was about the fact that they are no longer able to set the agenda. And that was the key change they were encountering, that they were, in the last many decades, they were the ones who set the agenda in terms of what food should be, how it should be produced, what the timelines for R&D should be, what the timetables should be, how it should be promoted, marketed, packaged, distributed, and made available. And that it all worked beautifully for a few decades, but it was kind of breaking down at around that time. And the reason for that was that for the first time, consumer, and going back to consumer, was beginning to set the agenda. Consumer was getting more educated, more concerned about what they're responsible for, whether it was for their bodies or for their surroundings, and they were starting to make different choices, speaking with their wallet. And then now, a few years later, that consumer has enormously more amount of data available, they have tools available, they have networks that they have available and they can form themselves. So I think the era of conscious consumer has arrived. And I think that's what gives me the most hope here, is the fact that the consumer is creating this demand pool that inevitably capital will come in and kind of applied so that we can have the satisfaction of that consumer demand. So I think that's the one thing that gives me the most hope, is that will create sustainable scalability of the right kinds of solutions. But it also does mean that capital has to organize, has to understand these trends, and really get to work on that front. So I'll just kind of end with two things. So on the venture and the supporting innovation side, I would say that each one of us, one of the things, we need longer term orientation. So yes, there will be institutional money that will be very important for that. But I think each one of us can kind of contribute to that. We have angel networks. So both Matt and I. So I think providing, being parts of those angel investing networks, if you are really interested in these sectors, having specialized groups who can understand, what these companies need, because the food system is a very traditional system. So innovation needs, you need the old, old school large corporates, as well as, the networks that are already out there in terms of trade and information flows and so on. So you need people. It's not like technology in the traditional Silicon Valley sense that it can be disrupted and disruptor can be completely on their own. So you need to have a marriage of the old and the new. And so if you could be active as angel investors, and we can talk about, we can help, in terms of how you could find those groups where you could, channel your interest, just even if it's for learning, but even if, small checks can make a big difference. So that's one thing that I would, I'm spending some of my time on kind of in developing. The other one is the fact that a lot more capital is needed for some of those ideas that got started 5, 6, 7 years ago, but they've now hit a wall. So you need what I call sort of growth capital for some of the deserving ideas out of that, who would really, who can be scaled up and become, globally life-changing solutions. So we need growth equity in that sense to support that. And for that, one of the things that I'm working on right now is a fund that is focused on this conscious consumer growth, because that's the best predictor of impact, of scalable success and impact. So that's, yeah, I would say, looking at how do we direct more and more capital to those ideas that will find traction with this conscious consumer who cares, who has values that I think all of us share, cares about the environment, cares about our bodies, nutrition, has, sensitivity to what's happening globally. We all want to create a more equitable world. So I think those were the two things that I feel energized by, and I think it's great to have people in this room that I can sort of sense have a similar orientation. So Matt.
Rajiv, thank you very much. We've all, in various degrees, discussed the need for innovation, and that we are looking at a problem where the old tools are not going to be adequate. Gally, innovation needs a catalyst. Any examples or any ideas of factors that can be a catalyst to solutions in this area?
I think the biggest catalyst, as always, is knowledge, and knowledge is power. And I think when you watch Kiss the Ground on Netflix with Woody Harrelson, or when you watch Common Ground, where we're screening it around the US or around the world right now, you will see the solution is as old as dirt. It really is. And it is under our feet, like Sean said. So sometimes we think of innovative solutions that at the end of the day, they don't innovate. They actually harm us. They actually take us back to where we don't want to be. And you heard from my colleagues, there's a lot of solutions out there. We're not lacking food. We're not lacking solutions. We're lacking a few basic things. Number one is collaboration. Humans are tribal. We weren't meant to grow up alone and live alone and live in some mountaintop by ourselves and garden by ourselves to provide our own food. Is a great novelty idea, but it's really a community idea. We need to live back in a community. We live today in a very lonely world. A lot of people are suffering from depression. A lot of people are suffering from mental health. And you got to go back to the root cause of these issues. And the innovation is simple, like start collaborating, working together. If the four of us decided to work together, we could address so many problems. We're going to use the Baratta Center as our launch platform of how to work together. We're all in the same issues. We've never spoken to each other. And it's just a little example of people who have the right intention.
Return my calls.
Ethics. I mean, there's root capital out there. And I know that Willie Food is trying to raise money and capital for small farmers. Baron spoke about insurance. Rajiv spoke about insurance. When we talk to our farmers, and you're talking about so many farms, I mean, I forget the numbers, but I mean, there's like hundreds of millions of farms around the world. And like we said, 90% of them are smallholder farms. There's no real voice to represent them, not on the local government issue and definitely not on the world platform. If we work together and we can find practical, simple, really not even costly solutions for them, we can immediately solve problems. But people want to really put money and power ahead of the local population. They're trying to solve problems from a point of view of, prestige and investments that are, let's go to the moon before we even just help local farmers create their own food and supply.
Let's stay in the world of collaboration. One of the themes of the Baratta Center is public and private, and having access to tools from those two sectors. Sean, you live in the public sector, obviously, but you work with a lot of private partners. Are they complementary roles? Are they sometimes competitive roles? I mean, do you get in each other's way sometimes?
I think mainly it's complementary, and I think we can use it more and more. At Catholic Relief Services, for instance, we have 2 impact investing funds currently. One is for water management, and the other one is for agriculture. So we do get investments that come in, and our philosophy is be bold yet humble. Be bold in our aspirations on what we do, but humble knowing that it's not us that do it by ourselves, but we need to have the local community and match that with others. Currently, as well, as we've heard some of the conversation here today about climate change around, there are a lot of investments coming into the climate sector. And so we're looking at that. Robobank has some, HSBC and others. And so there's a program out there called Restore Africa, in which investments come in, and it's dealing with carbon credits and things. We can work together, but we have to make sure that the local people on the ground aren't going to be put at a disadvantage because of some system. So when we do any investments or join any of these programs, we talk to the investors and say, local people can't lose their farms. You know, it isn't a way to take land. It isn't a way that we're going to corporatize farming sector and all. We have to make sure that we're doing it in a way that uplifts those small farmers in many areas because they get out there. And then the other thing is, we talked a little bit about technology and innovation. We have to make sure that we're using technology and innovation to help us link the small agricultural landholder with the private sector and with markets. And we're seeing that more and more. Almost everyone has a cell phone, and you can get out there and they can invest in different areas and sell their products down the line that can be tremendously successful. Afghanistan, in Western Afghanistan, we have a program out in Herat and Gore, and we're helping them putting greenhouses, and in a really difficult terrain where there's a lot of difficulties with climate and all, have these greenhouses. They produce potatoes, they produce tomatoes, and people had never produced so much and didn't know what to do with it. We then get them down and say, hey, how about bringing it down to the market, you know, and selling it? And so the technology doesn't need to be some type of technology that's up there that people don't understand. It's measuring water conservation in different areas. It's making sure people get to markets. And that's the type of technology that can be impactful right away. And so bridging that public-private is crucial to make that happen.
Thank you. Baron?
Yeah, I'll add to what Sean said, and a couple other parts is, so when we think about partnering with the private sector, particularly companies, number one, they have to approach it in an altruistic way.
Yes.
And so if we have, for example, a transportation company that comes in and says, okay, let me look at the UN World Food Program supply chain, how can we become more efficient? Because every organization can become more efficient. That then supply chain company can't come in and bid on the innovations that they recommended. So that, I think, is something we have to be very conscious of, particularly the private sector. But we have seen from the World Food Program USA a real lift in the corporate sector wanting to get engaged. We raised about $3 million from the corporate sector in 2019. And this past year, we're about 30 to 35 million. But I would say, very importantly, it's not just cash. We have to co-create. The private sector, particularly with companies, they're the innovators. And UN organizations typically aren't thought about innovation and technology. So what I would say is, how do we sit down at the table and then with the World Food Program and then the company and say, for the World Food Program, what are some problems that we can't solve on our own? And then maybe that company would take on one of the challenges in a truly altruistic way to help us solve it and invest in it. So yes, the private sector is a big focus right now of ours. But again, it's co-creation because just based on the financial donations coming in, we're not going to solve hunger. We need innovative approaches that come in through the private sector.
Great, thank you. At Georgetown, at the business school, one of the most popular courses among the students is sustainable investment.
Yeah.
Every year, over 200 students take a course in sustainable investing. And they bring passion, obviously, but it has to be married to corporate finance as well. And the corporate sector, obviously a big player. But Rajiv, this is for you. Is a concessionary rate of return, does it come with the territory? Are there arm's length rates of return in this space? How does the investor balance the expected rate of return with the goals of the underlying capital being invested?
Right, and that's a great question because obviously there are stated rates of return and expected rates of return, and then there are actual. So one of the things that I think you said, if you mean, so broadly what people call an impact investing generally was understood to be something where the investor accepted a lower return for the risk, the equivalent risk they were taking, because they were, getting something in on top of the financial return, which was the impact. But if you look at it, and I've now worked with a number of family offices for whom business as a force for good or impact is important. If you look at it in the longer time frame, as we talked about, actually those rates of return kind of converge. So if you're investing in the right kind of things, over a period of time, you will have, for impact, you will have a rate of return that is an excellent economic rate of return. I think what people miss out is when we have 5, 6, 10-year fund cycles and try to measure returns based on transactional sort of milestones, that we miss out on the accidents that happen along the way, and we don't count them. So yes, so I would say yes. I think if a concessional rate of return is an indicator of some kind of a qualitative way of people rationalizing that they're doing, ultimately they're getting a pot that's good and good enough, that's fine. But I think if I look at broadly impact investing, I think has come a long way. I think there was GIIN, which is the global network of impact investors. They did a survey about 10 years ago, and they had, I think, 30 respondents at that point in time. And the expectation was, yeah, they were interested in impact investing, but I think the size, the market size that they estimated was 40 billion. Now in 2022, the actual impact investing market size was 1.1 trillion. So it is, I mean, clearly, maybe there were measurement, it's clearly come a long way. And then there are 3 big pockets there. So there is the fixed income impact investing, which is something that I think, where you talk about, so where institutions like JP Morgan, Rabobank, many other banks have designed products where they will say that if you are, if our loan is being used for doing things in a certain way or creating a certain type of outcome, then we will give you, a discount on our interest rate. So that's kind of the concessional rate that you're talking about, and that has grown leaps and bounds. So those social impact bonds and these kinds of concessionally loans. So that's a big part. So when you look at fixed income impact investing, and I think that needs to grow, and like global financial markets, the amount of bond market and fixed income, the share of that needs to be, well, for impact investing as well, needs to be much bigger from where it is today, but it is growing. The second one, which I see, is what's called sort of public markets impact investing, which is people making choices in the investment that they make in public markets on good companies versus the not so good companies. And the Al Gore's firm Generation Investment Management, I think, started that trend by kind of making investments in what they're called sustainability oriented companies. That has also grown leaps and bounds. There are many ETFs and other tools available. But I think the one that I'm kind of really more focused is the private market impact investing. And that's where I think savvy people don't talk about concessional returns. They talk about total returns. And I think that's, and maybe the time horizon is a bit longer, but that is the one, that's the area where I see a lot more family offices now coming in. They were typically investing with their advisors, going on, investing in either public markets or sort of safe investments. Now they're saying, okay, we are much more concerned about the way our money is being used and what it is, what it is doing out there. And we are now directing
total return.
And I think that's becoming much more prominent and more active. So
I have a question for you about that, if I may.
Yes.
Because I think that in schools today, in all the programs, MBAs and all the different programs, people are concentrating on return and impact and all the right words. And sometimes I wonder what it really means for total return, because it means different things for different people. And we are in a society where we are in a rat race for measuring success. And I think that's where the root cause is. If we're going to measure success by money and the wrong impact, and we all talk about people and planet and have the right marketing buzzwords, and we're greenwashing through, like we ran out of the color green at this point, even, at the end of the day, what are we teaching? even when we're talking, I mean, I looked at the whole JP Morgan presentation and it's great. And Joyce is a brilliant person and clearly she's amazing at what she does. But I'm wondering, yeah, they're talking about commodity pricing. They're talking about returns. They're talking about impact, but we're not still addressing the root cause of all of it. And success today is measured by money and we can't fool ourselves. And when people talk about their companies or the rate of return, or even for the private families, and Anil and I had a lot of discussions about, do you first make your money and then go out and do good? Or do you do good from day one and then also make money? So I love the Patagonia model. I think our coffee company is definitely modeled with that. You have to start from day one. You don't only have to have purpose, you have to have coherence. So a lot of people have purpose and a lot of people really speak nicely, but they have no coherence. And when you're looking at the company from A to Z, not parts of it, there has to be coherence. So somebody mentioned a model of a company to me that I loved, which was, how about that the spread between the CEO and the least paid employees is 10%. So everybody goes together, including your suppliers, including your customers. It has to be more of a real impact. When we look at Kiss the Ground and Common Ground, what we measure is impact by views. Why? Because we're educating people through this kind of lens. And I think my biggest concern is, how do we create the transparency and arm the customers, the investors, and everyone else with transparency and coherence?
Right.
Because that should be the measure of success.
Right. Maybe Matt, if I could just add very quickly to that.
Sure.
One of the things that I
last
like.
word before we turn it over to the
Oh,
audience.
to the question, because I think the point that you made there is very important. So what is impact? And there are bureaucracies created today, you know, even by some of the large family investment groups that are mind-boggling and you know, overwhelming for companies to comply with. But I think what you just last talked about, which is, you know, what I tend to call it first order impact. So if you are an enterprise, if you're a business, what is the first, you know, what is the main thing that you're looking to deliver? You know, if it's a food product that is going to be healthier and going to reduce, let's say, diabetes, incidence of diabetes. Okay, then that's what you should measure. That's your first order impact. And that's all you need to report on. And if you're good at doing that, you'll be very profitable and you will deliver a lot of financial returns as well. So that's, I think that's the way we look at it in our fund, is first order impact. And then ultimately it's all financial goals, because that's how capital formation happens and reinvestment happens.
Terrific. Okay, so we have some time for questions from the audience. Right there, yes.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Just how much you've done to help hunger and ease the crisis around the world. So thank you very much for that. I'm not an economist, but I'm going to throw out a very naive idea and tell me how wrong I am. One of the most susceptible groups to food insecurity are subsistence farmers. It's ironic, but you know, it's true. When you go to a subsistence farmer and you say, why don't you practice no-till? Why don't you do this practice to help your soil? Or why don't you do this practice? The first response I see is, excuse me, I'm only, you know, have enough food for year to year. I'm not going to take some new idea on because I don't know how it's going to affect my family's food security. When you talk about on the ground type of issues, would it be possible to have an insurance type arrangement where you go to the subsistence farmer and say, look, I know you're worried, but if you practice no-till, we'll make sure that your family has food for the next several years, or however long it takes until you are satisfied that it works or doesn't work. So instead of just investing money that way, investing in it as an insurance program to make sure that if they do adapt to a new, as Gali was saying, you have all these new technologies that are out there, some of which are very straightforward. If they do adapt that, then it makes sense for them to make sure that they're not going to go hungry through that adaptation. Now, as I said, I'm not an economist. Maybe this is totally stupid, but
brilliant.
is that something that you guys have thought about, or am I just being totally naive?
Sean, I know Sean has.
And
Sure.
I'll add to that.
I don't think you're being totally naive, but we actually have a few different ways of doing it that have been successful as well. And that might be a way that could be successful. First of all, you know, as Gally was saying, what is our focus? And our focus as an organization, as you might imagine, is human dignity. And so that's at the center of what we do, and make sure that we're respecting the human dignity of the local people and they can participate in the process. But the other thing that we do is, if we get a community in a watershed area, we do example and pilot plots so that they can see what's happening in one and then transfer it to theirs. In other areas, if they have enough agricultural land, we can do small plots on each of the different areas so that people see where it's going. Once they start seeing during a drought season that my neighbor actually has several different crops that are going on instead of just corn or instead of just wheat or sorghum, then they go, hey, I want more of this. And we get the community from the other side of the hill and the other side of the mountain. The other thing you have to remember is the people at the bottom of the watershed are the ones that benefit. The people at the top of the watershed have to do the work that catches the water, that catches the soil as it goes down. So you need a more community approach. And so buying and selling cooperatives are there, and the community then works as one as opposed to individuals, and you get the farmers together. So we've been trying some of these. Insurance certainly is one way of doing it, but there's other innovations where you can have pilot projects and move those forward. We find that private investment is key for those testing, for the innovation, for the pilot projects. And then you can go to institutional investors who want to make sure that you can bring it to scale.
Yeah, I would add, the World Food Program heavily invested in insurance. 2 weeks ago, I was in Morristown speaking at Zoetis. If you don't know Zoetis, we're talking about private sector partnerships. They're helping us grow and expand 2 products. One is insurance for livestock. We do a lot of insurance. And by the way, as you said earlier, we're talking about smallholder farmers. We're talking about 5 to 10 acres. But what they're also doing is they're providing 350 veterinarians to make sure that the livestock stay alive. So I do think that insurance is a really big element of how the financial risk. I think what you said, I just need to amplify it 100 times. The most at-risk populations are the farmers, and they're taking the risk to provide food for their families and their communities. So we have to provide the safety nets, if you will, so that when they go to a extreme drought or extreme rainy season, that there is some level of protections. And then the other thing I would just add, separate conversation, but post-harvest loss is really huge, because you can grow the crops, but if you grow them and don't store them appropriately before they're taken to the market, and they don't last, that's a big problem.
No, I think it's a brilliant approach, and it's not just insurance. I think it's also about language. When you talk to farmers around the world, which again, 80–90% are smallholder farms, the first thing that the cooperative asks, or any of the buyers, is yield. They talk about yield. You need to maximize your yield per acre. What does it mean? That means a lot of agrochemicals. That means no risk taken. And that means absolutely no education that will benefit farmers, because again, you're trying to maximize yield per acre. A lot of the farmers come to us and say, I want to change to regenerative agriculture. I want to do no-till. I want to get away from monocropping, and not just because it's not good for soil or the environment or climate change, also because then I can feed my family better and I can work with the community. But how do they take the risk when they cannot put food on the table month to month? Their kids do not want the trade of being a farmer. So guess what? Our biggest risk for farmers is there is no second, third, fourth generation anymore in farming, except the big farms. When you look at the Farm Bill, and I'm a big advocate of Cory Booker, who is day in and day out, changing the Farm Bill, together with Gabe Brown, together with a lot of our teams from Kiss the Ground and Common Ground, is because the Farm Bill, people think it's for farmers. It is not for farmers. It's for us consumers. It's for every single human being who lives on this planet. That's what the Farm Bill is for. And the Farm Bill, as mentioned before, has all the subsidies in the wrong places. It's the subsidies for farming irresponsibly. It's the subsidies for creating food filled with chemicals and food that's engineered. And over 70-80% of grain in the US, or even more, is to feed CAFOs. CAFOs are the caged animals, chicken and meat. So again, it's not the cow, it's the how. Cows have to graze. And that actually changed weather patterns. And if you haven't read Lewis's book, Greenhouse Planet, please do. It's explained for dummies like me. It's very well teaches you all the misconceptions that we have about soil and agriculture. It's not as sophisticated as people make it out to be. To help farming will be very simple if we consumers understand and vote for change of the Farm Bill. And if we consumers, when we go to the grocery store, we're not tainted by all these labels that mean nothing. Fair trade is not fair if it's paid below cost, right? I mean, you guys are business people. You know, all these different seals like Rainforest Alliance, what does it mean? If your soil is filled with chemicals and the food is poisoned, what does this label really mean? So we need to come out with innovations and tools for transparency and education of consumers and farmers. If farmers understand that we're not just after yield, we're after a healthy crop and there is insurance for that, they will change. They want to change. Their kids, you know, we talk to farmers every day, and second, third, fourth generation want to stay on the farm. That's their dream, actually. Yes, they all want to be educated, they all want to go to universities, but they want their land. Land has a lot more meaning than just food. If you haven't watched Ken Burns' American Buffalo, the documentary series makes this all in a really better language than I just did. But land is important for us.
Another question?
Oh, yeah. So how do we make this stuff sexy? Because I think a lot of making ideas stick, you know, 10% of it is the information and 90% of it is how you communicate it. And so my question, because when I hear the term like impact investing, I would imagine a lot of other investors also, and I'm not necessarily an investor, but I would imagine a lot of investors like, all right, well, I'm probably going to lose money on it, but I might feel good about it, you know? Whereas but that's not inherently true, because if you look at, I think KPMG or McKinsey did a study on the S&P 500. They looked at the diversity of the board across the S&P 500. They found that the companies that had more diverse boards outperformed those that didn't. So I think the incentives are also aligned. So how do you just communicate that in a way where it's like, hey, you're going to also make more money, dude? You know, like what do we do?
I'll give you my quick answer. The market recognizes that already. The number that Rajiv said of almost $2 trillion is in the ESG market already, both debt and equity. So I think the marketplace recognizes that. My approach would be not just to talk about the statistics, but to talk about within those companies, within those investments, what is the money being used for? And it's those projects with the innovation that a number of us have talked about. That's where the sexy part is. And from a student's point of view, where are the jobs in this marketplace and how can they get jobs in that marketplace? That's where the attraction is.
How do we stay away from the greenwashing of it? Because ESG is filled with greenwashing. And if you haven't watched John Oliver on carbon offsets, that's just a fraud, most of it. The ones making money out of carbon offsets are really the bankers, not the farmers. There's a lot of innovation and sexiness in all this world of people and planet. It doesn't translate. It doesn't translate at the end of the day to the majority of farmers, to the majority of people who need that help. The companies feel good about themselves. In the annual meeting, the board member, you know, the board chair comes up and he shows the quarterly earnings. And as a scientist of USDA told me one time, he said, you know, Gally, I will support you because it's you. But let me tell you something. When you're in that boardroom and they're talking about quarterly earnings and you're talking about everything that you want to do, you're going to be the laughing stock. Because at the end of the day, unfortunately, the majority of corporate America doesn't care from the heart. They care from their numbers perspective. They care from their brain innovation of how to make it look good. But like my colleague said, where is the coherence of making it a real impact, real translation, but from the heart, from the real point of view?
Let me put the burden on Rajiv.
Yes,
No, but I think this is the question that I think everyone is asking, and therefore, you know, you're in a way seeking the answer in asking the question. So I think that's the key thing here is, you know, when you think about making a decision, whether that's an investment or buying something, if you're looking at, you know, is this going to be good for me, or, you know, is this investment, what is it going to do? Is it going to, you know, whatever is the impact measure that you might, I mentioned diabetes earlier, but if you think about, you know, a better nutrition outcome, that's, I think, going from a compromise mindset, which is, okay, you know, I'll do this, I won't see the money back, but I'll, you know, feel good about it. I think going away from that mindset to saying, okay, these are the things where this is where they can, if you look at Gen Z and you know, whatever is following them, if you look at their spending patterns and how they are making these decisions, okay, you know, this is what I'm, you know, investing in, which will have a 10x market within 5 years, 10 years. I think going from the mindset of making a compromise to making, you know, a fabulous investment that will create a lot of return, I think that's what we need to go to. And part of that will be, you know, how do you make sure that you're doing the right thing and not greenwashing, is making sure that we have a lot of education, a lot of transparency, a lot of information out there that is authentic, that allows for these decisions to be made for the true impact.
Yep.
Oh,
way in the back.
I grabbed up. So I had a quick question just to go back to maybe a comment that Gally had said earlier and that Joyce was talking about. Like we're saying, oh, sorry, if you can you hear me? We're saying that we have enough food, but it's not necessarily getting to the people, right? And if we just take out the food waste, which we know is a huge issue, I would love, and maybe this is for Baron, to understand more the concept of food. Is it more calories or is it more nutrition, and like how you weigh that? Like, what is that food that we have? Is it just calories or is it actually nutritious?
Yeah, so a great question. So we'll talk about food waste to begin with, because some of the innovations that we're working with right now are working with smallholder farmers that when there's imperfect food, imperfect fruit, it's put on the side of the road and creates emissions. So we're looking at using green energy to dry the fruit, to store it, to pack it, to sell it, and it goes into a canned soup, maybe, for example. I think our key is around homegrown, locally produced. That is the solution. So when we talk about school feeding, maybe as an example, it's rice, it is beans, all locally, but then there really is a vegetable. So it is a very nutritious meal. The challenge that we have is that it becomes less nutritious when you're dealing with Gaza, when you're dealing with South Sudan, and you're talking about trying to keep people alive. And so, you know, for me, it's getting food to communities that where our staff are safe, where we have the logistics set up. And by the way, I should also say, we do all work together in some way. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of partners that Sean and I work with right now to make sure that food is being delivered. But I have to say, it depends on the circumstance, depends on the environment, depends on the safety, depends if local homegrown school meals is an option. I would also say, you know, one of the main challenges within a lot of countries we work with, we talk about migration, but I will say it again, many times it is about income and it's about safety. People migrate to the US because of a lot of safety concerns. That's why there's mass migration around the world. I was just in the Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya, and you know, 300,000 people because of war in neighboring countries. So you know, it's war, providing, and then there are, in many countries, they build the availability of creating homegrown school meals. So again, it's looking at each situation. Where can we produce and procure locally, and where do we need to procure in other countries?
Maybe if I may add
Sure.
another perspective to that, which is clearly, it has to be nutrition and not calories. I think we've lived in the world of yield and calories for a long time. We need to graduate to nutrition. One example that I think everyone even here can relate to is, if you look at longevity and nutrition in old age, one of the things that everyone understands that as you grow older, your ability to you need more protein because your ability to use protein efficiently goes down. And so a lot of old age sort of nutrition prescription includes things like Ensure. I think the biggest market for those kinds of products, because they are high in protein, is older age population. Because of muscle atrophy and so on and so forth. But the point is those nutrients and supplements are useless, by and large useless, because they are not, again, they cause more trouble than help in terms of, yes, just providing more calories or more particular nutrient isn't the solution if the body cannot digest it. But there are solutions out there where you can make that protein much more effective as it goes into the gut, breaks it down. So I think what we need, not only nutrition, but also more precision, in terms of efficacy. So, and that's, I gave the example of, supplements as you grow older, but I think that's applicable across the board, even for animal nutrition. So if we, a lot of chicken and hogs are fed with cornmeal, which is the biggest commodity in the world. But zyme, which is the main protein in corn, is not digestible by either birds or, by and large, not digested by either birds or hogs. And it's kind of really, a big percentage of that feed is useless. But you can. There are so we have to go on both fronts. We have to become more regenerative. We have to kind of more restorative practices, but also we have to kind of think about, we are in a new world, so we need some new things as well, which is how do we use the production and the nutrition stack that we have? How do we use it most efficiently? And that's where work on new enzymes and new ways of making sure that we can use them. We can maximize the utility for what we produce in the areas that we produce it. So that's maybe just one.
And as you said, Rajiv, food is medicine, and it's no secret. Food is medicine. You are what you eat, and there's more and more science around it. And if you listen to Mike Heyman and how he, goes around treating different things, the food we eat today is there's no doubt it causes disease. And every day it's proven more and more. There's glyphosate in Cheerios, for crying out loud, in baby formula. There's glyphosate in tap water, in raindrops, there's glyphosate. We've gotten to the point where, as I said at the beginning, we are solving a problem, but creating a much bigger one. And again, it's going back to basics. Soil will save us if we know how to use it. If we can go back to regenerative agriculture, that at the end of the day will mitigate climate change 100%. It will feed us, it would heal us, and it will also, it's proven that it creates conflict, climate change. So all that cycle has to be broken, but it will only be broken if we all chip in with knowledge, with working together. There's so many consultants out there, I can't even tell you how many, that they are put to solve the problem. They've never been on a farm. They've never spoken to a farmer. They don't even understand the problem, but they get paid. There's hundreds of millions and billions of dollars allocated to them to solve the problem. And I think when you speak to people who are on the ground, when you speak to farmers, when you read books like Lewis's, you start understanding that the solution it's not novelty. It's not that innovative. It is as old as dirt.
Good. Thank you, Gavin. Before we say allow Anil to say a final few words, let me give a round of applause for our panel. Thank you. Thank you.
And questions? Let's say you can meet the folks in the next 20 minutes. That'd be great. Just a couple of questions online as well. We've done that all first, and we'll get back to the great discussion. So let me kick off things to time to this group and also help with the next steps. So Matt, as promised.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
to the panel.
Really
Great
nice.
discussion. You took Joyce's 30,000 feet level down to the details. So I took away several things, and I think I must say, Joe, that this is a working group forming here, right? So we get this is an agenda that's going to go forward. And thanks to the audience for those questions as well. We don't know exactly what form. We'll continue this discussion. We'll be back in New York in a few months as well. There's several events in DC also that we'll keep you all updated on as well. I took away a few things. One is, I think, weaponization of food has become the geopolitics. Geopolitics is a slow pendulum, as we know. It's going to continue for a while, right? It's not going to go away tomorrow. So I think that's a clear negative theme we heard today. Great inspiration from this group, talking about the first mile. I think we heard about the last mile. They're talking about the first mile. The first mile is about the farmer, the organic food, growing approaches, the soil and water conservation. That's the first mile. That's important as well. The last mile too, distribution, as you said, Baron, is important to get food to the right people at the right place, time, and that's a big challenge as well. There's no shortage of food. Clearly, technology will solve those things, but there's no shortage of food. I think we heard also about the notion of the role of the public and private sectors. And the World Food Program is that a FAO program? Right. So the multilateral involvement as well, because this is not a US problem. It's not a South America problem. It's a global issue that we have. And then lastly, I would say the importance of innovation, I think, is key, that everyone highlighted. So a few things to maybe conclude here. One, as I said, we will continue this conversation. I think people talked about awareness and sexy. I think we'll make it at least aware. Sexy is another term for another time, but we make it our agenda to make awareness the first thing. And I think the same thing is true of climate as well. I was at COP28 last year, and one of the key themes that no one talked about was communication was missing, right? There's a lot of talk about policy and funding and all that, but communication was missing. And the same thing is true here as well. So a couple of things to wrap up the Baratta Center themes. One is July 16th, I mentioned we have a conference in DC on Ukraine, reconstruction, resilience, and so on. We also have a conference on October 8th in DC, which is our annual conference. The theme is going to be something around globalization and regionalization and some such flavor. We already have a couple of speakers confirmed, including Terry Wirtz, who's an astronaut. He's going to talk about how he feels like, pale blue dot, and kind of bring the thinking of investors and industry folks and policymakers from that perspective. So I know that's a little emotional dimension, but I think without that, we don't have rational balance of hard measures and good measures as well. On October 3rd, and this is not going to be in the US, we're actually hosting a conference in Doha. The GCC ministers asked the Baratta Center to facilitate a discussion very much like this one, not on food, but on how regional development in financial sectors, in equity, in terms of the GCC collaborating comes together. And this was inspired by the Department of Commerce doing their Indo-Pacific Economic Framework about 2 years ago. So I guess we are pulling together several ideas from the Baratta Center and many of the themes you've talked about today in the ways we are engaging communities of interest, and I call it the coalition of the willing. Let's not worry about those who are not willing, because the coalition of the willing can change the coalition of or the others as well. Last thing before can you put the screen up? Oh, there we are. So I do want to highlight two of our colleagues at the Baratta Center. Joe Jasper is the head of. I was going to say, actually, rather than cheers, any complaints you have, send it to him, please. And Joe Foyer, who's the director of membership. I think greeted to Joe as well. I did want to thank the University Club as well for having us host the event here, and one of your friends, Joe, who is the sponsor. I don't think I met M. There we are. Thank you so much for hosting us here. Sir, promise we'll be back next spring at the University Club again. With that, I want to thank everyone. Thanks for a great discussion. We'll follow it up. All of you should expect an email, partly thanking you, but partly also highlighting a couple of next steps. And such a great success to actually be in New York City. It's a great, of course, the city, but in addition, having all of you here as well. Now, thank you very much for being here. Thank you.